Australian farmers, they have been hearing about environmental goods and services, which are estimated to be worth by about 2050, something like $48 billion to the Australian economy. Now, the problem with these environmental markets is there's a fundamental mismatch between the size of an average farmer and the size of an average corporate buyer. And so it's through aggregation and coming together that farmers can meet the right sort of supply and demand that is demanded of the market. The other thing that's preventing farmers from accessing the environmental markets is the actual structure of the markets. So because they're too small, usually at a farm level to the they're going through brokers. Now, those brokers are sitting between the buyers that have a need for often carbon and other products. And once they've secured a buyer, they're looking to get supply of the environmental goods and services from farmers, preferably one farm or as few farms as possible. And then they want to, maximize their commission between buyer and seller. And your typical margin of a broker is 50%. So given these sorts of reasons, the complexity, the cost, the lack of suitable size and fit between buy and supply, not many people have actually entered into the environmental markets. But there is a lot of interest because there's potentially a lot of value there for farmers, and they're really at the front line of the twin environmental challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. What we think that happens when you create farmers a farmer-owned, wholly aligned vehicle is that you're reversing the market structure and the market systems. And farmers are likely to see 80 cents in the dollar in their hip pocket, 10 cents in the dollar goes to a local farm group that helps support all the farmers in the transaction. So that'll be a local Landcare group or a group of practice or an industry group. And then 10% is really the sort of brokerage fee that enables the mutual to aggregate the environmental goods and services and sell them with the legal and technical and other regulatory costs embedded in that. So how did we create the Regen Farmers Mutual? Well, we started from the sort of ground up basis of starting to work out, well, what are the environmental goods and services that are out there, and how do you monetize them, and how do you measure them, and what gives them credibility? And from that, working with about 80 farmers, including people like Sandy Eager, who's on this webinar today, and many other farmers and land carers around New South Wales and broader across Australia, they came up with a business model and the principles, and then even the scaling. So how would farmers like to be approached in terms of environmental goods and services? How would they like to aggregate together? And we got pretty clear on this by about May. What are we now? Early September, with a launch in 4 to 6 weeks' time. So the mutual has come really from a groundswell of farmers, and in it they've asked for a different type of broker. And literally in the constitution of the mutual are farmer-centric principles, like the principle that the farmers should control their data. If you left that to a company, a corporate-owned broker, there's no way they would enshrine in their constitution principles such as that, which might in the future avoid their profit maximization. And the other thing that we came to learn working with farmers to create the mutual and to catalyze it is that, whilst there's usually one person, we call them the cat herder, an effective group usually has a leadership team, and that leadership team is then responsible for bringing on farmers. And you'll have experienced that in your local Landcare group between a coordinator and informal roles such as who does the facilitation, who does the scientific and financial and various components of a healthy functioning group. And the Mutual has enabled groups all across Australia. There's 6 on screen now, but I think we're up to 14 to start their creation of a transaction that farmers can get involved with. And that those transactions we're calling pilots are likely to be the first cabs off the rank when the Regen Farmers Mutual launches. One of those that's worth explaining is Sandy's. So Sandy's in the Bellingen local Landcare group, and she has farmers that are in the rural area that can move from set stocking to time-controlled grazing. And in doing that change in management practice, they're likely to sequester or improve their soil organic carbon, which sequesters carbon and has the dual benefit of improving water holding capacity. And so your flood catchment area has greater water holding capacity in aggregate and greater flood mitigation capacity in aggregate. But down in the valleys, you know, where that water is pulled into the river, a lot of the riparian zone has been cleared for farming and industrial and other purposes. And so the water's tending to rush through those valleys and make flooding events worse. It's possible that using biodiversity offsets, you can actually re-establish those riparian zones and improve habitat and improve biodiversity. Additionally, down in the coastal areas where you've got inundation from floods 12 out of 14 years, there's been an event, and inundation from rising sea levels, the connective biodiversity and the built infrastructure that moves floodwater around is really important. It can make the difference between the sewage works or the hospital or certain roads being damaged or unavailable to the community. And so what farmers can do in an aggregation, like in that Bellingen community, is work at a catchment level to access several environmental markets, the carbon market, the biodiversity offset market, and as a result, create a collective landscape scale impact, which reduces flood impacts and mitigates the flood damages to the major urban population that lives by the coast and has all that built infrastructure. So that is an example, one of 14 types of transactions that we've got going. But it all goes to say that when we aggregate as farmers with other farmers, we improve the farming outcome, we improve the economic outcome because we're splitting the fixed costs of the transactions between more people. And we're bringing to market environmental goods and services that people want. As an example, we're talking with Transport for New South Wales, who have the cost of repairing those roads during floods. And they have, you know, a real need to reduce the amount of flood damage. But currently there's no environmental market for flood mitigation. There's environmental markets for carbon and biodiversity. But the Mutual then has the ability to open up value for farmers that other brokers can't look for or would not be encouraged to go and look for because they represent themselves as opposed to farmers. And so in total, the farmers that we've worked with that have been catalyzing this have come up with a business model that works across the whole value chain. So Regen Farmers Mutual helps groups to engage with one another in a local area, to define the environmental goods and services and the types of activities they can do, to proactively market them either through regulated, voluntary or emerging markets. And then by nature of these environmental goods and services being sort of yearly contracts over 25-year terms, where they need to be verified annually to make sure that the land outcomes and the buyer outcomes are achieved so that payments are made. The Regen Farmers Mutual is there to assist and provide infrastructure to farmers across Australia and farm groups that they belong to across that whole value chain. Now, we do that through 3 corporate structures: a fund, a company that, you know, helps the farmers manage their data, and a company limited by guarantee, which is the mutual that owns both the fund and the company that manages the farmers' data. Where we are at the moment, we incorporated the company limited by guarantee in July. We incorporated the digital company yesterday, with a launch of the Regen Farmers Mutual for middle of October. We'll be launching with a capital raising, an equity crowdfunding style capital raising from farmers predominantly. And farmers during that crowdfunding raise will also be able to purchase an initial environmental farm assessment that for $1,000 gives them a good view as to what are the environmental market opportunities that are available for them. So let's start to understand that environmental farm assessment. What it does is it uses a shared information collection process to get a pool of data around that farm and its practices, and a map of that data and a geospatial map that enables you to see what are the soil areas, where are the testing zones. Then the farmer and assessor enter in that information and make it available with your permission as a farmer to various organisations that can then interpret that data and give you back an indicative view of your opportunity as it relates to their specialty. So, for example, standing carbon is a environmental market facilitated by the Carbon Farming Foundation. They can interrogate the full CAM database based on your farm map and give you an idea of how much and what value you could plant within your property. Similarly, FarmLab provides a soil carbon offset report to tell you what's your current level of soil organic carbon, gives you a baseline, registers you for the ERF soil carbon methodology, so that in year 2, you could start earning money from your soil carbon. And Accounting for Nature gives you an econ valuation. Overall, this enables farmers to then work out how is the best way for them to benefit from environmental markets. So thank you for allowing me the time to share with you what we've been doing at Regen Farmers Mutual and where it's at. What I'd like to do now is invite a few questions. But before I do that, I actually have to return back to the presentation because I've totally forgotten to tell you how this ties in with Landcare New South Wales. So bear with me. I'm going back to my presentation. So how does that work for you guys with Landcare New South Wales? So we want to recruit farmers locally so that farmers can make a landscape scale impact so that they can share the costs of any transaction between them. So it reduces the costs for each of them. And so that they can start to open up environmental markets that they otherwise wouldn't get into. We've got an agreement with New South Wales Landcare, with Victoria Landcare, with AgForce in Queensland to educate farm groups about environmental markets. We do that through several webinars. Now, those webinars talk to how to understand environmental markets as webinar 1. And then webinar 2 talks about how to access environmental markets. Now, we're totally about being education led. And so, farmers will get full disclosure about, should they do nothing? Should they do it themselves? Should they go with a broker, or should they form a local group? But when they form a local group, the benefit of doing that is that it helps them to create that peer-to-peer relationship and scale of transaction that's needed to transact in that $48 billion emerging economy. So It helps them, as we say, to access the experts, to access the markets, to get the knowledge, to understand their opportunity at a local level, and then ultimately to be paid for the activities that they do on their farms, which are a public good. Now, if you're a local leader or already involved in a local group and thinking, hey, we could pull together a transaction, then you need to have, clear line of sight as to how you could be paid for that. So in the business model that the farmers came up with, they saw 80 cents in the dollar in their hip pocket, but 10 cents in the dollar from each of them going towards the farm group. And that farm group is going to need to deliver various things throughout the process to help bring the farmers on pre-transaction, during the transaction, and during the compliance and measurement phases, and even to bring in, that social fabric that keeps good groups together. And so in paying that 10%, the farmers are able to pay for social, ecological, professional support from local Landcare coordinators that act as the Regen Farmer Mutual Group leader. And we try and make this very easy for the group leaders. So we help you to work with, the existing platforms that you might already use. If you're already using Facebook, we've got webinars, we've got access to experts. There's support from myself and Leah Harris, who's on here. There's really good educational resources, and we've tried to make it so that, the groups that are being led, and there's 14 of them across Australia already, that they're in a Slack group and can work with one another and share best practice. You'll also notice that, we try and template things so that it makes it as easy as possible to go and gather your first organisers that are your leadership group, and for them to then gather farmers within their influence. And you'll notice that we have our own inbuilt network at the regenfarmersmutual.com website, and we have a Facebook social learning platform. Now, collectively, these are all designed to funnel groups and members of groups into the 2 webinars. As I mentioned, these are about understanding environmental markets and then accessing environmental markets. And the call to action from all of that will be, if you want to know what your farm's environmental opportunity is, then you probably need to get an environmental goods and services value assessment. And that'll give you an idea of the carbon and biodiversity and whole of farm opportunities. It'll tell you how much your interest rates could be indexed by according to your EG&S, and it will set you up to show the greenness of your food and fibre and the commodities that you're producing off your land. You will now have a path to show your green provenance. Thank you. And this actually is the end of the formal presentation. And now I'd invite some questions. So sorry about the 2 times there. If you have a question, you can put them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand.
Linda has her hand raised.
Hey,
and
Linda.
Everybody should be able to unmute themselves now.
Go for
Hi,
it.
thanks for that, Andrew. Just have a few questions, but one that's just popping up initially for me is, who pays for the Landcare coordinator to be involved in the early stages of this project? I understand that there's a trickle effect when the when the payments start rolling in, but that could be 5, 10, 20 years down the track. So who's funding these stretched coordinators to do extra hours to pull these groups together? Thank you.
Yeah, so in each of the pilots at the moment, this sort of pre-transaction costs, we've been, as the Regen Farmers Mutual, connecting various groups with grant applications and with introduction to philanthropic organisations. We're also working, say, with trying to get some government money to help with those pre-transaction costs. Now, once the fund is created, which is 12 to 14 months time when we've got some volume, actually then the Regen Farmers Mutual will have some liquidity to help pre-transaction costs develop as projects. But at the moment, we're having to work quite piecemeal through that. But we recognise it's a huge barrier is, you know, until you've got a transaction, you do have some costs of gathering. And it's really one of those areas that we're hoping to add as much value as possible by connecting environmental, philanthropy, government and other pools of funding with those local groups that are starting to form, so that we can immediately, start to pay the local coordinators, and those farm groups can start to have some robustness to the style of transaction they're trying to develop. Rowan, you might also have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So there's Linda, like keeps coming up as the primary barrier for these transactions to kind of come together, because as you correctly identify, it's like we'll do the work on the basis that we're being asked to do the work on the basis that, well, a transaction may or may not emerge, that may or may not get funded. So the work that's being done on that is in and around identifying that project funding is effectively a piece that needs to be, a process needs to be put in place. So we're looking at how we can create a process that takes, once you've identified a concept in a region, so there's a concept of, it might be, this is the outcome that we can achieve, this is why it's a priority for the local community. So there'll be various key criteria that identifies a nascent project as being worth kind of investing in. So there'll be, once we can identify that, if we can bring that to the mutual and then go, right, so the mutual have relationships with philanthropists, with government, with corporates. And what we're looking to do is to, well, in the first instance, use those relationships to reach out to those funding counterparties to get that project funded. And so the way we would do that is to assist in taking that concept from that stage to wrapping a pitch document, a briefing document, and a video, so that there's effectively collateral to enable that concept to be presented to potential funders with a view to getting project funding. So there's not a huge, what I'm trying to describe there is there's not a huge incremental amount of work to be done in order to be able to create a pitch, if you like, that can be taken to funders. And what we'll be trying to do as the mutual is then create a kind of panel of funders. So we're talking to the AEGN, so the Australian Environmental Grant Makers Network, for example, about how we could create a kind of a monthly, okay, in this month we have this pilot is presenting their project, or whether it's a more interactive, more dynamic process where we share those videos on as and when the pilots come to the fore. And similarly, we're also talking to the Marketplace for Nature about, which is that group that's pulling together how we can pull together the buy side, so that the buy side, the corporates, government and institutional buyers, how they can access more supply. So they're interested in helping projects be created because they want to invest in the projects as they come out. So we're talking to the Marketplace for Nature about supporting this idea about, if we create a process to enable projects to present to the group, can you bring the group together? Does that kind of talk to your point, Linda? That what we're trying to do is to solve that exact problem.
Thank you. Is there a pilot example where this has already kind of happened, or you've only just sort of got to the point where you're registering and kicking off, or have you actually got runs on the board, I suppose I'm asking? Yeah,
well, it's fairly dynamic. No, it's not. Runs on the board is, well, we've only got 2 pilots that are kind of more progressed. And I guess our prototype for this was with the work with Sandy, where we put together a pitch for the NAB Foundation grant, where we were shortlisted, and they told, it was one of 6 shortlisted out of 50 applicants. And that process was probably a little bit more labour intensive than what we'd like to be able to kind of do in order to be able to pull together. But that was a kind of prototype. We're now working with, for example, Loddon Plains of Victoria to do exactly what I've just described. So kind of create a process around it so that, like, here's the criteria that the project needs to meet. So we're working with them to go, right, okay, what is the criteria we need? And what is the, and then how do we take that to create that briefing document and the video and the pitch deck, which is what Wardy and I have been doing in Incubator Co-op for years now with startup cooperatives. So it's not an unfamiliar process. We just haven't applied it in this context.
Thank you. What was the Victorian Landcare group that you were working with?
Loddon Plains. So we can introduce you to Danny. Well, he's a lovely guy. I'm sure you're happy to take all your calls.
Thank you.
I think
we have a hand up from Margaret and Mitchell as well.
Margaret here, Margaret McKinnon from Upper Snowy Landcare Network. I'm in Linda's the regional Landcare coordinator for South East. So we're a group within that, and we've been doing a lot of re-veg projects over the last 5 years to combat dieback, but and fortunate enough to receive quite a lot of bushfire money to keep going with re-veg projects, and that's probably something we'll continue to do for the next 5 years. So my question is, so we have this money to do these projects. Is a group of projects like that, and maybe ones that we can collect together around the region through our regional Landcare network, if we brought those to you as a suite of projects, is that the sort of thing that you would assess and say, oh, we can build on this and develop something here? Is that a starting point? And the related question on that is, can we put government funded projects or already funded projects up there to start earning carbon credits, because they're almost all on private land?
Yes, potentially it's a great place to start. I mean, the real reason for wanting to work with Landcare groups so closely is that there's such a shared ethos around farmers doing Landcare, and the activities of Landcare have been, erosion and salinity and weed management and tree planting. And essentially this is an opportunity to give Landcare groups, in addition to the government grants and existing means of accessing fundings, an ongoing and more sustainable revenue stream by helping those farmers monetize those activities they've been doing for 20 or 30 years, but through environmental markets. So where you've already got a nucleus or a group of farmers in your local area focused on a potential transaction-worthy set of activities, I mean, absolutely, that stands to reason that would make a great head start for any group.
Margaret, there's one thing that we're trying to grapple with at the moment. So we're talking with NRM Regional Australia, for example, Regions Australia, is to understand how we can kind of contextualise the opportunities on a farm within the region. So to understand that landscape scale impact.
Yes.
So the Bellinger case is really clear because the flood mitigation is just such a, it's a easily understood concept. But so we're trying to understand whether it's the NRM region plan, which brings the kind of, you're talking about, we've got these projects on, that are underway. How do we bring them together? Or is it possible to bring them together into a coherent kind of transaction, if you like? And we're wondering whether the NRM regions plan is a good place to kind of work from with respect to that.
Yeah, I like the idea and the concept, but the practicality of doing anything at a regional scale is just so difficult. So where I'm coming from is basically the driver of all this is that landholder who's willing to put aside a bit of land and maybe pay some of the upfront costs of planting trees, but she wants to get money from it, and so it's driven by a lot of little individual cells rather than a top-down regional view of restoring the landscape. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Mitchell, I think you've had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks to the webinar. It's been great to listen to this. Just be clear that you can hear me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, we could. Then you went on.
Yeah, no, it just came up. The host muted me, so I don't know what happened there. So I'm heard now, I assume. I have a few questions about targeting. So I assume that the very real scenario will be that there'll be a prolonged period where the availability of funds to cover the ambitions of Regen won't match up. So how will you selectively target the works which, how do you determine which are more important to go first rather than, or are you going to do them all at once and just give a few coins and share the pot? Yeah,
so there's a few things in there that we should unpack. So we're infrastructure that groups can use to move their transactions through, and so when transactions are ready, they can come to market when they're cost effective and at a scale to do so according to that group. But we don't really operate like a traditional targeted fund, in that once you open, say, 15% of the Bellinger landscape are into a transaction, you still want the 16th to 95% of that catchment to join that transaction. So you want what are called open transactions at the mutual. So when I join a health fund or a super fund, I'm an individual member of that fund, of that mutual, but I'm joining an existing product, dental and optical, health and fitness, whatever that particular thing is. The same will happen for farmers in a local area. They'll join Regen Farmers Mutual, and if there's an open product in their area, they'll have to, go through a product disclosure statement and get an assessment for their premium, but ultimately they'll just be joining an existing product. So farmers can come on one by one, but we use a fund mechanism. So the mutual has a nature fund, which enables us to bring on farmers one by one, but then aggregate into whole tranches where the buy side might be after hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars per tranche when they buy, whereas the average farm might be anywhere from $40,000 to $400,000. So we've got to make sure that that liquidity is insured by the fact that we have our own fund, and that it can manage that, irregular supply and, large transaction demand side. So the exact mechanisms for that, if you want us to take you through, we can. But was that answering your question, Mitchell? Was that what you meant?
I think in many ways it does. Yeah, I guess it's that you put forward a campaign and then you look for people to join on that campaign. So it seems like your first target is to flood-shed initiatives within Bellinger. So yeah, one of, I assume. So you've got these campaigns and then you're looking for participation of landholders.
That's right. So we've got quite a few campaigns. I'll take you through roughly a few of them. So with the Food and Agri Business Network, it's Queensland based, but they're farmers between Noosa and Gympie. They're typically smaller land holdings. They've got low carbon opportunities, but high biodiversity opportunities. What we're helping them do is use the Accounting for Nature Econ Tier 1 measurement process and go through the state-based LRF program, which is carbon plus biodiversity using the accounting for nature tier 1. So that transaction, what we're doing is enabling that group to come together, to describe the benefits across biodiversity, to set up the impacts and measures regime so that they've got compliance. And then it also provides for that group the opportunity of green provenance. And as other environmental markets start to mature, such as food nutritional density, animal welfare, and other areas that they're or runoff, because a lot of them are coastal, and water environments will start to get environmental market concerns around them. As that group emerges and as those environmental markets emerge over time, they will use that cornerstone carbon plus biodiversity benefit to add other landscape scale impacts collectively that they're having, and then they're able to distribute that to the farmers based on their input on a pro rata basis. When we're talking about Loddon Plains, Danny earlier in Victoria, essentially it's a standing carbon opportunity, and they've already got 90 regen farmers in their Landcare group. And those guys were interested in, well, how do we actually connect in a corridor that runs east-west, these biodiverse plantings, so that we can connect two bird species that, well, two bird populations of the same species that currently can't get to one another to make baby birds because there's no continuous habitat bridge. And so using bushbank, standing carbon, and potentially money that will unlock from protecting and providing habitat for these bird species, we're able to fund a transaction that gives all those members something to aim at and something to recruit their fellow members onto, so that they can see how they fit initially into that biodiversity corridor. We've talked about the flood mitigation. It equally applies to drought resilience. So we're talking with the Riverland wine growers and the Barossa wine growers, particularly around how increased soil organic matter can improve water holding capacity. Increased efficiency use in growing grapes can lead to environmental flows, and how all of that can be used for drought resilience. And so we're very keen to have as many prototypes, as many explorations that are locally led and organized going into environmental markets as possible. We think that partly what we call markets at the moment are actually regimes, where if you follow the bouncing ball, where if you comply with the top-down requirements, then you kind of get awarded with accus that you can then sell on at to buyers, which happen to be 95% government. So the government's telling you the regime, issuing you the accus and buying the accus off you. That's a regime, not a market. What the mutual enables is a real market where farmers in a local area within a context that are doing environmentally useful things at a landscape scale can go to the likes of Transport for New South Wales, or the likes of the World Wildlife Fund, or the likes of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Foundation, and say, what is it worth to you guys for us to be doing these sorts of activities, and how can you incentivize us to continue to do those incentives and broaden them out across our catchment? And that's when you've actually got a market, because then supply and demand are communicating and having that infrastructure to communicate, and they're just having price discovery and term discovery. And that's what we're really trying to create here is a true market, because if we don't do that for biodiversity and for soils and for habitat, and we follow this sort of top-down regime-led markets like we have in water, and like we're looking like we could have done in carbon, you get these perverse outcomes, environmentally and market-driven outcomes, like you see with the water market. And frankly, we can't afford to to biodiversity and soils and everything else, habitat, what we've done to the water market, we just won't be here to see it out. Anyway, sorry, that was a rant. See somebody's got their hand up.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, Woody, as well.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
You want to?
So Linda Kavanagh has asked, how does the Farmers Mutual reduce the costs for the individual landholder, and can you provide examples in dollars?
Well, I mean, in aggregation, you can save costs through group buying power. So if you need to share the ecological services, baselining services, soil sampling services, it's purely a group buying scenario. In terms of examples in dollars, I mean, we were able to negotiate for a full CAM interrogation for the whole of the Loddon Plains network for free. Whereas if those farmers had gone and got that interrogation individually, they would have paid, I think it's $110 on setup and then 50 cents a hectare. So they're examples of how coming together as a farm group can save individual farmers money. I'm going to unmute this person. I can't see their name. Margaret, I think it's you again. Margaret, a question?
Well, yeah, comments really. I think you're right on the money because, for example, a really good example in our area is that, you know, we have this huge dieback problem at landscape scale, and we have lots of people who want to plant trees, but the startup costs are high, and trying to get onto the carbon market is impossible for that small landowner because of the complexity and the marketing costs and so on. So there's a real need for somebody in the middle like Regen Mutual. But at the same time, we've got this enormous, well, it's a snowy activation, so government-led Snowy Mountains Activation Precinct, which is going to be doing a lot of development around Jindabyne and up in the ski resorts, and there's going to be a market for biodiversity credits, and they will want to buy them locally. And then we're a very, you know, second, the two main economies are tourism and grazing management, and there are plenty of people around who are just, I think their incomes are very marginal at the moment on grazing, even with the high commodity prices, just because the land's just taken a huge hit from the drought and so on. So income generation would be very attractive for many landholders, but getting them together, so Landcare traditionally in this area has been strong, but it's not anymore. So those people have kind of gone elsewhere to do whatever they want to do in terms of sharing information to a group called Monero Farming Systems for interest. So there's interest there, there's the base, but actually activating and using the carbon market to earn money is just a problem that we've been thinking about for 5 years and been following very closely. And I see there's a discussion paper out now how to make it easier for the individual farmer to earn money from re-veg plots. So I'm making the comment really that I think there's a lot of elements that we could work with, and I'd welcome a kind of separate conversation with you guys just to explore that a bit more, to see whether it's a goer. So yeah, it's not a question, it's basically a set of comments to say that I think you're in the right space, and I think that you've come via the right route, via Landcare, to get this done.
So good, Margaret. The one thing that, just to take up your point about the biodiversity in the snowy screen, so that's somewhat similar to our conversation with New South Wales Transport. So New South Wales Transport being the biggest buyer of biodiversity credits and their response has been really interesting. So they have responded really favourably to the idea that we're kind of turning the conversation around a bit, because we're coming to them with, okay, here's a group of farmers that can deliver these impacts. And it's not just biodiversity, so we can layer up whether it's social impacts or whether there's other kind of flood mitigation in that case. Yes. But if we can bring farmers together to have that voice, and so they can also look at that landscape scale impact. It changes the nature of the conversation, not
Correct.
just because you've got a better understanding of the problem at a bigger scale, but you've also got an institutional entity talking to the other party.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's really, yeah, so that's
Yeah.
so useful.
I can see the power in that. So yeah, I think you're on the money.
Couple more questions from the chat. What do you see as the minimum land size for inclusion from Linda? And it also relates a bit to Jessica's question, which says traditionally the greatest barrier for involvement in these kinds of programs has been either land size. I see that you're allowing for neighbours to combine to be big enough, but also cost of assessment before you know the potential benefit. You mentioned $1,000 during the fundraising. Is that for a community group or for each property? And is that the total price for the assessment, or is there more costs for the individual environmental markets to be identified?
Yeah, so the environmental farm assessment will give you we are going to market with $1,000 product, and it's for any farm size, and that will give you an indication as to what your opportunity is: biodiversity, standing carbon, soil carbon, water markets, whatever, whole of farm score, green financing, interest indexation. And from that, you still would need to go to your bank to get your interest indexed. It's just an indicative form. You'd still need to go register for a soil carbon project and use that material that you've gathered in the farm assessment as your baseline, but you need a second year assessment in order to make the difference between year 1 and year 2 payable. So you've got additional costs. It's not the full costs just at $1,000, but $1,000 then gives you the decision-making information as to what sort of farm plan you need, what sort of offer you can take to market, and the ability to work with others to aggregate the size of offer till it's at an economically and ecologically sensible scale. And the Farmers Mutual has the accredited assessors. Yeah, we're working with a pool of assessors, so Accounting for Nature and AgForce and Land to Market and Carbonate and various others. And we've just experienced so much interest from the wine industry, from MLA, from various technology companies and other, industry assessments, whether it's by ag industry or within the environmental market space. So that the idea around the digital farm is that we take that data pool and through our assessors, and it's owned as the mutual is by the farmers, and they have control over their data, and essentially they're permissioning the lender or the Accounting for Nature partner to run their algorithm over that pool of data. They're not taking possession of the data and then running their algorithm. The data is maintained with the farmer, and then that algorithm is run over it and presented back to the farmer on their dashboard as a score or an econ or a map, or appropriately visualized for the farmer. And that product's about $1,000, but clearly it's a product that's entry level, so that you can then build your farm plan, so that you can then build your transaction, and that does have other costs associated with it.
So that's what we're undertaking the crowdfunding for through November this year, to fund the development of that first piece. So we've got a prototype that's being developed through the pilot that we're currently undertaking. Out of that, we'll take those learnings to build the product that enables what Wardy just described. So that's the, as I say, the funding that's being undertaken through a crowdfunding through November. And those skills,
Craig?
sorry, just the one other question was those skills aren't in-house. The idea is that the mutual stays a smaller organisation to keep its costs low. So there was a follow-up question from Mitchell, are the farm assessors in-house? No, the objective is we're leveraging a pool of it's on the ground expertise. And so that's engaging locals to do that work basically.
The assessors need to be trained to collect the information, but they can be contracted locally. So one of those principles is local first. If we can do something in your local area or region or state or country first, that's the priority.
I think Craig's had his hand up for a little while.
Thanks, Leah. I'm just wondering to what depth those assessments go. So is any of it include a soil test or a flora survey, or is it just imaging and desktop assessment?
No, there's in-field assessment. We use the Accounting for Nature, Soils and Native Vegetation, Tier 3, as the collection for soil data and for vegetation, composition and configuration. And then we use water use efficiency measurements like infiltration rate, penetrometer rate. And then if required, we'll do a chemical residue and food residue test as part of what carbonate need in order to do a food score and a farm score. But all those are set up and using the Accounting for Nature 80% confidence Tier 3 econ measurement and what a sampling process that Accounting for Nature have developed.
Cool, thanks.
Another question from the chat. Not sure if this one's been answered yet, but can the assessment happen anytime or anywhere?
Well, only once we launch, and it'll be in 2022 that these assessments can actually be delivered. Yeah.
And or do they need to join a regional group or have that established before they get their assessment?
No, but clearly you want those people that are getting farm assessments in your local area to be in a local group so that they can coordinate the transaction that collectively they're doing. So it stands to reason that you will join a group and that you'll, enter into your assessments at about the same time, but that they aren't necessarily linked.
And Linda and Lynn have asked what happens if you're in a drought and you lose soil carbon or biodiversity loss, fire, etc. Yeah, I mean, the agreements that you make as a farmer with the fund, there's a few things that give you some assurance. One is that the co-regulated reporting annually on what's there enables you to know the difference between somebody being paid to do native vegetation plantings, and then they've come through and cleared that area with a bulldozer. In that case, the land outcome and the buyer outcome have defaulted, and there has to be a way for the fund to correct the behaviour of its member. And collect and collateralize the collection of loss for the group. But if there's been a bushfire through that region and as a result, or a drought through that region, and as a result, the index of the whole landscape scale product has reduced, well, then you can actually have that covered through the fund's collateralization obligations. So collateralization works like this. Like if I'm going to sell, if I've got 100 tons of carbon, I can really only sell 75 tons of it. You've got to leave 25% at an individual level for collateralization. When we aggregate as a local area into a group, there's collateralization from all of us spread there. So if someone got burnt out by fire,
there should be enough within the group to cover those losses so that it doesn't affect the whole of the transaction. And then farm groups within the mutual have collateralization. So if one farm group through drought or flood or fire or whatever completely lost their ecological landscape, we have collateralization across the fund to make sure we could still meet our carbon or biodiversity or other commitments. And so there is some challenges there, but it is also doable in the case that it's biological loss of biodiversity or carbon. We know that will come up. If it's the case of deliberate or you know, commercially the farmer has decided to do something other than which they've been contracted to do, well, then it's just like a typical commercial contract.
Are we just getting close to the 1 o'clock mark? And I just wanted to let everyone know that I will be sending you an email where you can have a one-on-one with Wardy or Rowan if you would like to, just for a quick chat. If everybody doesn't get their questions answered, you can also email us as well. And there was a question we haven't answered yet, which was what was the minimum farm size?
Oh, no minimum size as such. There'll be an uneconomic size for people to, but you know, potentially even a 2-hectare farm could engage in biodiversity plantings on a riparian zone, depending where it's located.
And Margaret has her hand up.
Yes, Margaret.
Sorry, I don't have my hand up. I think I was trying to lower it, but I might have raised it.
That's okay.
Did you just say that we were going to you were going to share the emails addresses so we can do follow-up?
I will send everybody an email afterwards with the email addresses and also a link to book a quick one-on-one Zoom meeting with Rowan or Woody.
Oh, that's perfect. Thanks.
No worries. And the videos, the webinar has been recorded for those who weren't able to attend. So.
Oh, cool.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Enjoy your lunch.